Hello and welcome back to Protect Life here. Um, I am today delighted to be joined by Dr. Paul Cullen, who is an Irish-born doctor, but has been living and working and practicing his arts, medical and scientific in Germany for some time. Before we get on to that, I'd like to just invite you to do a couple of things. You see the subscribe button there, you can click on that, and that will mean that anytime we have new material or new work coming online, you will get notified about it. The second thing is, as you know, we're facing into some fairly serious campaigns at the moment, having the right to life of the elderly and the very young, the ill, is being threatened by legislation, the proposed legislation at the moment in Ireland. So we need to work on that, and we need your help to do that. So if you can press on the donate button there, anything you can give to help us in that will be greatly appreciated and will be used well. So I'd like to welcome you, excuse me, Dr. Paul Cullen. So you are, I believe, sitting in your office or your home in Munster, is that in the south of Germany? I think
that's in it's the north west of Germany. We're about 80 kilometers from the Dutch border. So if you know where the Ruhr Valley is, Dusseldorf, we're about an hour north of Dusseldorf and a little bit to the east, to the west. So we're about 80 kilometers from Holland. Yeah.
All my life, I've had this notion that Munster was somewhere down south, and I know Munster simply because 100 years ago, my sister won an academic scholarship in German to study.
Okay, all right.
And loved it. She said it was a very beautiful place.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's nice. It's a university city. It's very nice. Yeah.
Could we just start off with a little bit about Paul Cullen, right? Where you came from, your family background, and how you got to, and sort of the journey towards where you are.
Yeah. Well, I come from Dublin, from Rathfarnham, and that's where I grew up. And I went to the Christian Brothers School in Ballyroan, for anybody who knows that. And then after my leaving cert, I studied medicine in UCD. And the clinical part of that training was at the Mater Hospital on the north side. And we had in those days an exchange program where Germans between Dublin and Hanover in Germany, but the exchange was purely unidirectional. Lots of Germans came to Dublin, but nobody ever went in the opposite direction. And I had been working in Germany as a student to earn money in Munich, and I picked up a little bit of German. And I had one of the students also came over, interested me. So I decided that I'd go there for a year after doing my intern year. So I thought I'd work the exchange the other way. And as often happens, I kind of got stuck there. And then I came back then to Dublin for a while, for a few years. I came back, left in 83, came back, I think, in 86. And at that time, 1986, things were kind of difficult. And it's also in Ireland, if you don't come from a medical background, it can be difficult to find your footing. I wouldn't say now that I was discriminated against, but it just can be a little bit difficult. And I was also interested in research. So I moved then again, and I went to the Hammersmith Hospital in London and started in research there, mostly in cardiovascular disease. And then I had a scholarship to go to the United States, Fogarty Fellowship, to go to Columbia University in New York. And I was at that stage married to a German, and I thought, okay, when I finish the stint in New York, I'll come back to Germany. And I wrote to a professor in Germany who was eminent in that field, and he offered me a job straight away, so I never actually got to New York. So I went then to we moved to Munster then, and that's where I've been ever since. So I think that's probably, I don't know, about 25, 26 years now.
So I got in contact with you through a mutual friend of ours,
Yes.
Dr. Claudia Kaminski.
Kaminsky, yeah.
Claudia is an old family friend. In fact, back in the days of going back to the days of my sister studying German, her
All
first
right. Okay. That's a long way back.
back was when she was 14, was
Yeah,
up in North Rhine-Westphalia over in Kreuztal with
that's right.
the Kaminskis. And I know that you're from what Claudia says, that you've been involved in the pro-life movement in Germany.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, if nothing else, how do Germans take to the fact that a foreigner, as it were, being involved in this subject? It's obviously a subject which stirs passions and deep divisions with people. Does the fact that you are not German, does that ever cause an issue?
Well, I mean, it's a very inflammatory issue, and I get, you know, flack on left-wing blogs and so on, but I don't get any extra flack because I'm Irish. I get the same flack that everybody gets, but I have to say that, as opposed to the time I spent in London, where it can be sometimes, you know, subtly difficult if you're Irish, okay? I never felt anything like that in Germany, I have to say. I've never felt that I was treated differently or in any way worse, not coming from Germany. No, that wouldn't be true to say.
Obviously, we've had our very disappointing results here with the repeal of the amendment, the 8th Amendment here.
Yeah.
It's not what we're going to be talking about today, but just briefly, how do you, in Germany, this has been a fight that's been going on in a different context for a very long time.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you keep going? How do you, as a movement, as a group of people, how do you keep going in the face of that sense of running against the current, running against the popular mainstream?
That's I think a very important question. I think if you know, if we compare the legal situation in Germany and Ireland now, the protections for life in Germany are actually better than in Ireland.
Yeah.
So there are, you know, there's a cooling off period, a 48-hour cooling off period. There's a mandatory you know, the pregnant woman has to go for advice, which is mandatory. Now that's sometimes honored more in the breach than actually that it's carried out, but at least it's in the law. Mm-hmm. And you know, I think I don't get the impression, although there is resistance, I don't think there's the same amount of vituperativeness, let's say, that I've noticed in Ireland during the debate. You know, there's not the same level of invective that I noted in the Irish debate. So that would be one thing. The second thing is that I think that we, you know, it's not this pro-life, the abortion question is part of a much bigger life question. Yeah. And at the moment, you know, we had a very disappointing judgment by the German Constitutional Court a few months ago in related to assisted suicide. And, you know, the secular tide, or the tide in the culture, is very much moving against us. That's the same here, the way it is everywhere in the West, let's say. But I think, you know, if I ask myself what keeps me going personally, the question is, well, what is the alternative? You know, what is the alternative? Well, there are two alternatives. One is to say nothing. Yeah, that's not an alternative. And the other alternative is to go along, and that's certainly not an alternative. So really, you know, you're not really left with an alternative. And also, you know, changes can occur culturally that we're sometimes not aware of. Things can happen. It's not, I think it would be wrong to completely abandon hope altogether. So if you think of a thing like fashion, you know, a movement arises in fashion. Where does that come? Nobody knows how, you know, but suddenly it's there. And, you know, in the culture, things can change like that. They become as a groundswell, and then they've been going on for years. And afterwards, maybe it's obvious where they came from, but at the time, you don't know. So I think those are the three reasons, really, I would say.
I think that the last point you make, particularly, if we look to the United States, we have seen a very slow but gradual change in culture across many sectors in the United States. And I think what's particularly interesting is if you look at the younger generations, they are becoming more secular, less religious. The United States was anomalous, if you like, for a long time as this large, developed Western country, but still very religious.
Yeah.
In its wider population. But even as the younger populations are becoming less religious, they're becoming more pro-life.
Yeah.
So, as you say, we don't quite know how these things happen, but all we know is that I suppose we stick at it and hope that in some way something that we do may have an effect that we're unaware of.
Well, I mean, I think you're perfectly right. And I think there is a kind of a moral sensibility. Now, I wouldn't agree with all the measures, but there is a moral sensibility, you know. So, for example, if you take the vegetarian movement, you know, nobody would have thought that vegetarian, like 20 years ago, that vegetarianism would have become as mainstream as it has become, or even let's say the anti-smoking movement. Now, I know there was a lot of campaigning, but I don't think the sea change with regard to attitudes towards smoking was a result of government campaigns. I think it you know, that might have that occurred at the same time, but I think it was a change in attitudes, and also things like, let's say, environmental sensibility. That's another thing that we wouldn't have predicted perhaps 30 years ago. So, you know, I don't think, I think it would be wrong to say, you know, that there's a lack of moral sensibility in the coming generation. Probably that the opposite is the case. And yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I also used the word fashion, and I think there's an old phrase, saying, quote from Wilde, who said once, if you want to make war, if you want to stop war, don't make it immoral, make it unfashionable.
Yeah.
And I think that there's actually a very deep truth in that.
Yeah.
I'm very aware when I listen to my nephews and my niece these days, or people say in college age, sort of age here, if on the subject of racism, that something fundamental has happened, not in Ireland, because frankly, until very recently, we didn't have a diversity issue in Ireland, because we didn't have diversity in Ireland. Was you had Scots Gaelic Presbyterians against Irish Gaelic Catholics, and that was what we called diversity. It wasn't a whole big, it wasn't a very diverse population. It's changing now. But something fun, they find the idea of racism and the expressions of racism, it's not just immoral, but low. Just something low, it's something vulgar, it's something that they find just, they don't want to be associated with. And that's happened, I don't think, without any, oh, yes, there's been education, but nothing particular. I think it's something that's happened in the wider culture, and maybe it's a part of fashion. And as you say, that's a moral sensibility, and if that moral sensibility exists, it can be harnessed.
Well, it's a thing. I don't know, is the word cool still cool, but it's a thing to, I mean, I've been out of the country for a while, but it just stops, things just stops being cool, you know, or becomes uncool. And exactly. And that's it then. It's dead. That thing is now dead. You know, once it gets the label of being uncool, it's kind of dead, you know, and I think that's what happens, yeah.
So we are living in unusual times.
Yes,
I mean, we all, I think, have that weird moment where you get used to a situation and then something happens and you think, is this really happening? Is this, or is this dreamlike? Yeah. Now, so
is this reality?
Yeah, or is this just fantasy?
Yeah. Caught in the crossfire, no escape from reality.
Oh God, we'll leave it there.
Open your eyes. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I'm reminded of another song lyric: "Clowns to the left, clowns to the left, and me food to the right."
Right, yeah.
I'm stuck in the middle with you. Now, Germany is getting a lot of very, very good press, and has pretty good press for right from pretty well the beginning of the handling of the COVID crisis, for the pandemic. So, can we wind back? This thing starts to happen in China. We see the first voices we hear in January. I can vividly remember because a friend of mine was talking about this basically from not long after Christmas.
Yeah.
and terrifying me. He said, there's this thing coming from China. Nobody else was talking. I don't know why he particularly was aware of it, but he said, there's this thing, it's coming, I can tell you. And lo and behold, unlike all the other things that we were promised, this arrived. I think we first became aware of it in Italy, and those dreadful scenes in those northern Italian cities, like places around Milan, places like Bergamo and Brescia, and in Veneto. So, can you remember when when you first became aware of it in Germany, or how that early stage and the reaction in Germany, and what happened?
Well, I can remember it very well, because in my daytime job I run a big lab, so we're doing a lot of COVID testing. At the moment, we're doing about 4,000 to 5,000 COVID tests a day. Okay, wow. So we do the testing for about 1,200 doctors in private practice in about 40 hospitals, various local health centres. So we would do the testing really for a catchment area, perhaps maybe 1.5 million. So we would be serving a population maybe the size of Dublin, right? And so we've been stuck in the middle of it from the start. And I think we're moving now into the second wave. Okay, so we had the first wave, which started at the end of February, reached a peak perhaps the end of March, and essentially was gone by the end of April. And now the second wave started maybe about 7 weeks ago, slowly, but now it's picking up speed. So we're actually, the people spoke in the first wave of exponential growth, but it wasn't actually exponential. But the growth we're getting now in new cases is exponential. And you're seeing it, particularly if you look at France. So France, I view France as being 6 weeks ahead of Germany.
Okay.
And if you look at the figures in France, so in the first wave in France, at the peak, which would have been around the end of March, we were seeing about 5,000 new cases a day. All right, and then the mortality started then in France with a lag of about 12 to 14 days. So about 14 days after the first cases appeared, the first people started to die of COVID. Okay, and that curve increased to a maximum of about 1,000 attributed deaths per day. Now, I don't want to get into this argument, was it with COVID or from COVID, but let's just accept the official figure. So
the figures there,
yeah, so we're into 1,000. So, and the other thing was, if you look at the shape of the curve, the shape of the curve of new infections or positive PCR cases, and the shape of the mortality curve, they had the same shape. Okay, so we were seeing the same phenomenon with a lag of 2 weeks and a factor of 5 to 1, so 5,000 to now. The second wave in France is now underway, and the number of new cases is in fact it's over 5 times what it was the first time. So I think there are around about 25,000, more than 25,000 new cases a day.
Wow.
Okay, so if you say, okay, 5,000 cases in the first wave translated into 100 deaths, how many, if we're getting 25,000 cases, how many deaths? Are we seeing 5,000 deaths? 5,000 to 1,000 deaths. So if we're seeing 25,000 cases, are we going to see 5,000 deaths, which is the same proportion? Well, no, we're seeing 60 to 70 deaths. Now, this is more than it was in the intermediate phase, like in June, let's say. The deaths were in France were down to maybe 3-4 a day, and they're back up to 70. So that looks like a lot compared to 4.
Yes.
But it's not a lot when you compare it to the number of positive cases that we're seeing. And I think this is what we're seeing in a lot of countries, and we're seeing the same thing in Germany. We have a second wave now, which is as high as it was in the first wave, but we've nothing like the number of mortality of cases. And I think, it's hard to get to it's hard enough to define what a mortality is, but I think it's worth sticking to that number rather than say the number of people in intensive care units, because that's a kind of a soft statistic, whereas the mortality statistic is a pretty hard statistic, and the number of positive cases is also a fairly hard statistic. So that's what's happening now, and so we're running into the second wave. We might, you know, there's talk of a second lockdown. I don't know, is that going to come? It may not. But certainly what we have is you know, in the population, there has been a lot of fear inculcated into the population. Yeah.
We can just roll back to the first wave. I mean, I'm giving numbers off the top of my head here, but they're pretty, like, they're fairly close. The Irish numbers for deaths per million were around 350, 354, which meant that we were doing pretty badly, I would say. If you strip out the fact that in the top, I think we're officially number 13 in Europe. Above us, you have countries like San Marino. Well, a couple of micro countries are included in that. So, we're not doing brilliantly well. Germany was down around 100, was it 100, 110 cases, which is still a lot. I mean, in comparison, say, for example, to Slovakia, which is bizarrely low at 17. They have a lot of new cases. There's a strong second wave in Slovakia, but they persistently have this very, very low level of fatalities, which is curious. And anybody would like to have a guess at that? First of all, Germany had a high case number, just as had a high caseload pretty well as anybody else, but it was far more successful, say, than certainly than Italy. At one stage, Italy was had the highest fatality rate in the world, better than France. The Atlantic coast countries seem to be doing very badly. Portugal, but Belgium very, very badly. Netherlands doing badly. Ireland badly. UK badly. So, what were the Germans doing better?
Okay, well, I don't have all the numbers in my head, but I'm working on a publication with colleagues to do with care of people with COVID in nursing homes, and as part of the background to that, I compared 3 different countries. Now, I took the mortality, the 7-day rolling average for mortality, because I think the mortality rate is the best statistic. Okay, and so the mortality rate in 3 countries normalized for population. Okay, now if you take Germany as one, okay, so the maximum mortality rate in Germany we set as 1. Okay, well then Sweden, let's say, was 4.
Okay, in
the peak. Okay, so I mean, this is a rough measure, but it's more or less true. So Sweden had 4 times as many deaths from COVID in the first wave as Germany. And, you know, people would tend to say, well, this is obvious because the lockdown, you know, there was a lockdown in place in Germany. There wasn't in Sweden. But if you take Belgium, which had one of the most severe lockdowns in all of Europe, right? Belgium is at 9.5 on this scale.
Wow.
So Sweden was higher than Germany, okay, but Belgium was more than twice as high as Sweden. And now in the second wave, okay, Sweden has a second wave in terms of incidence, but has no mortality, virtually no new cases, new deaths. So the question is, what's going on? Well, can it be the lockdown? It can't be the lockdown entirely, because you wouldn't get results like that if it were completely the lockdown. And so what is it? The answer is, I don't entirely know. It's maybe, like these things usually are, a number of factors, okay? But I think that one of the critical factors, and this was something we also saw particularly in New York, for example, is the care of elderly at-risk people in residential institutions. And if you look at, you know, the people who are dying are not like a report I saw today, you know, the 33-year-old bodybuilder from Ukraine. He's an atypical COVID death. Most of the people, you know, are elderly people with pre-existing conditions. And if you look at cases, for example, in Sweden, 60 to 70% of their deaths occurred in nursing homes. In the UK, the same. So I think, you know, when the dust settles, we will find that the mortality story of COVID is, to a large extent, it's a story of death in residential care facilities. And yeah, so.
Sorry, just one thing. So people say, and I think something a little bit, possibly what you're saying is, a number of people here, without getting into the politics of the lockdown, etc., say, you know, this is actually a disease which only, it is only dangerous to a very small number of people. The vast majority of people won't be fine. On the other hand, so I see that and I think to myself, well, okay, but 700,000 people in Ireland are over 65. 400,000 people in Ireland are between severely and morbidly obese. 190,000 people have diabetes. We have hundreds of thousands of people with asthma. We have the 8th highest rate of asthma in the world. When you start allowing that there's going to be a certain amount of crossover, you're still talking about a very large proportion of your population. So it's not really. So is it that that age is the real factor? I know obesity, and speaking as a person who is slightly obese, obesity is considered increasingly to be a very serious factor. But is age the key here?
Oh, I think age is a very important factor. And if you look I think the most powerful figure is the mortality rate. Okay, and I think the second most powerful figure, or probably equally powerful, is the total death rate in the country. Okay, so if you look at Germany, for example, did more people die in this flu season in Germany than died last year? No. Did they? No. In fact, if anything, the death rate over the entire flu season was probably a few thousand less than the long-term average. All right, including all the COVID deaths. And if you look in Sweden, for example, had a slightly higher rate than 2019, 18, and 17. But if you go back further, the reason 17, 18, and 19 were years in Sweden where the death rate was particularly low. The death rate in Sweden, even with the COVID, without a lockdown, was no higher than in the long-term mortality death rate in the country. So I mean, it's important. You know, you have to, when you're talking about this, avoid being cynical. I don't want to be cynical, and I don't want to make light of people dying. I'm not trying to do that. But you know, you have to. The average age of deaths in Germany from COVID was, I think, 82 or 83. The average life expectancy in Germany is 79. And so, you know, you have to think of it in terms of years of life lost. And you have to, you know, we have each winter we have an episode of infectious lung disease. You know, it could be influenza, it could be adenovirus, it could be coronavirus, makes up about 10 to 15% anyway. And you know, it's often the case that we're infected at the same time with more than one virus. We don't usually detect that because we only test for one virus. Most people with flu are not tested at all. So the question then becomes, if we weren't testing as intensively, you know, would we see that? You know, would we have seen it? And you know, in a flu epidemic, if you just on an anecdotal level, if you speak to your friends, or if you think about your own family, you'll know people. You've either had the flu yourself, or you'll know someone who had it. If you speak to people and ask them, do they know somebody who was seriously ill with COVID, you won't find many. I'm sure that's the case. So it's, you know, it's something different going on here than is normally going on. So
the lethality rate does seem, I mean, this is something that has struck me, that in the second wave and as it's progressed, the lethality rate has clearly declined.
Yeah.
Now, so the question I'm asking is, okay, we allow that if we look at the demographics of the people who are getting COVID, it's a much younger cohort. The single largest group of people getting COVID now in Ireland, and I think this is reflected across Europe, is the 25 to 34 age group.
Well, okay, if I can interrupt you, Michael, there's just one. You know, I think it's important. to make a distinction between having a positive PCR result?
I want to get onto that.
Yeah.
I wanted to
Okay. Okay. Well, go ahead. So, okay.
I really want to get onto that. But if we look at people who either present with symptoms or else have a positive PCR result, you're looking at the cohorts are 25 to 34, and then the second group is the 18 to 25, and then very low levels of infection for small children, very small children, but teenage children, also teenagers getting it. So this is a group we would expect simply to survive at much, much higher levels. Secondly, even though we may not have a silver bullet pharmacologically to deal with it, doctors, I talk to doctors and they tell me that they have learnt from their experience that they're slower to go to intubation. Just simply, I was told that the angle putting in bed, that is the effectiveness. And there are a cocktail of antivirals that they're using that they find can be useful, particularly like most antivirals, I suspect, if got early in the stage, so that the medical management of the disease is improving, and therefore we're getting better outcomes. Is it also possible, I'm just trying to, is it also possible that we're seeing something which has supposedly happened before, that you get that sometimes with a virus in a second wave, that the virus itself simply becomes less lethal, slightly weakens?
Well, there's a whole lot of issues there. To address the last question first, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right, which is the COVID-19 virus, is an RNA virus, and they tend to mutate. So the influenza virus is also an RNA virus. They tend to mutate. So that's the reason why there's a different, the flu shot is different each year, because we're trying to fit the strain that we have. But once a strain is in circulation, it doesn't tend to change that much. Okay, so it's unlikely, and the vaccine manufacturers, I think particularly Pfizer, have looked into this. I saw a paper on this, and it doesn't appear that the strain that we have, the strain at the moment, hasn't mutated. It doesn't seem to have mutated.
There was an extensive paper done in India, was published also.
Yeah, yeah.
Which said the same thing.
Yeah.
They saw change. There was. They expected is that every 14 days you would.
Yeah. So they haven't found it either. Yeah. So you know, what is it? Well, it's probably herd immunity. Okay. So you have to ask yourself, why does flu die out in the spring? Why does it die out? Well, the answer is we don't know why it dies out. We attribute it to the better weather. We attribute it to people, you know, being out rather than being locked up inside. But that's just like the way people, you know, these experts on the stock exchange are always experts after the event. The real reason is we don't know, but it is the case that it happens. And so I can't give a definitive answer either, but I would assume that it's probably more related to a developing herd immunity, right? Now the interesting thing about COVID is that at the start, there were antibody tests to COVID, but they never really gained traction. And the reason they didn't gain traction is we found after a while that the level of antibodies, once you had infected, tended to drop off. And the second thing is we're not sure if the antibodies that we're finding are actually neutralizing antibodies that actually neutralize the virus. And we're not sure if the main source of defense against the virus is an antibody-mediated response or a cellular response, T-cell, it's called T-cell response. So we don't know really how it is, but it would seem to me to be the case that maybe the reason we're finding fewer older people might have to do with things like social distancing, or that they're staying indoors. That might be the case. They're not presenting for testing. But certainly that cannot be it cannot be the complete explanation for the dramatic fall in case fatality.
What do you think? What do you think of the theory which says that we started this process with the assumption that this was a novel coronavirus, and therefore we should treat it as a virus which potentially could affect 100% of the population because there was no natural immunity, but that maybe, in fact, that because there are a number of coronaviruses which are endemic, and that in fact some individuals in the population may have a form of immunity through their exposure to other coronaviruses, to this coronavirus. Is there anything to that?
Oh, that's certainly possible, but it's hard. It would be hard to investigate that, and I'm not sure if that has been, rigorously tested. But that would be possible. I mean, 15%, as I said previously, of the respiratory infections that we see, particularly in children, are due to coronavirus. And when this came up, the question was: is it a kind of a baddie coronavirus like SARS or MERS? Okay, or is it one of the normal coronaviruses that we have every year? And we didn't know that at the start. Now, the thing about SARS and MERS is they're so lethal, they don't spread because they kill everybody, right? So the virus is it's a trade-off between lethality of the virus and infectious. So if a virus is lethal, it has to be pretty infectious to manage to spread before the host is dead.
Yeah.
So it became this at the start. We didn't actually know, was it like SARS or MERS, which have a case fatality of 30 to 50%, and so this was at the start. But it was pretty clear, I would say, by the end of April that this wasn't the case. And then, a lot of these models came out, particularly from, I think what's his name, Imperial College in London.
Yeah.
What's that?
Ferguson.
And he was the same person who was involved in the mad cow disease, and I think the swine flu as well.
Yeah.
And he produced mathematical models that didn't really hold up, and governments then made decisions based on mathematical models based on much higher fatality rates than turned out to be the case. And there is also it has to be said that when people like Ioannidis from America produced much lower numbers, which are reliable numbers, that never really gained traction in the media. So there's a particular narrative now which has become mainstream everywhere, not just in Ireland but everywhere, which is difficult to break. We were talking. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that became, so if I can say this, obviously speak layman, so you forgive the shall we say, the lack of nuance or the lack of understanding. One thing I've kept on hearing is that one of the things that may be a predictor of how sick you get, or if you get sick at all, is the phrase that I kept was the viral load. And there was the belief that, so for example, if you got into a situation, say, where you have people living in very close contact, like in care homes, and a number of people became infected, that rather than being infected by one person, you're being infected by a whole series of different people, and this increased the amount of virus you were almost, rather, and this is very gross, I'm sure, very way of expressing it, but rather than getting a drop of virus, you're getting a whole spoon of virus, and that was in some sense predictive of how sick you got. So that, and now it may be the case that people are becoming infected, but they're becoming infected by a much lower level of exposure to virus or from one person. Is there anything to that, or is that just nonsense?
Well, I'm aware of this argument. This is the argument that if you wear a mask, it doesn't stop transmission of the virus, but it stops transmission of enough of the virus that the viral load infecting the other person is smaller, and this then is going to cause that person to develop a less serious disease. That's kind of the theory. I don't know, has that ever been rigorously tested? There are a number of things to say. First of all, even on the Diamond Princess, if you remember that case on the boat, not everybody got infected, and of those who got infected, a large proportion, I don't know off the top of my head how many, but a large proportion were asymptomatic. Okay, so those are people who were in quarantine together for months and months and months. So they would have, if they would have been exposed to large amounts of virus, almost necessarily because of that condition, and it didn't lead to an infection. No, I mean, one thing is true. I think it is, it's generally accepted that if a virus infection is going to take hold, the infecting virus has to be present in a particular concentration, right? So the infection seems to take place particularly at the back of the nose, not so much in the throat. So you need to have a certain viral load before an infection can occur. All right, because we have a local immune response. We have, first of all, a physical barrier, okay, mucus, and then the body produces antibodies at the surface. So there's actually antibodies in that. So the virus has to have a certain a charge to it, let's say, to get past that. But having breached that defense, whether let's say the force of the attack is in direct proportion to the number of virus particles present, I'm not sure if that has been ever rigorously tested. It seems to me that argument came up particularly in relation. There's a meta-narrative and then a number of sub-narratives. One of the sub-narratives is the mask narrative, right? There's a whole kind of wiki of masks, okay? And one part of that is the strand is, oh well, the mask might not stop the virus entirely, but it reduces the amount. So and the severity of the infection in the infected person is related to that amount. But I'm not sure if that has been rigorously tested.
You used a phrase there, and that's one of the great words of our time, which will bring us on to the testing issue as well, which is asymptomatic. Now, there was a study, a number of things. There was a study produced in the UK recently, which said that 86% of cases were asymptomatic. There's a study in Ireland which suggests that 76%, 75% of cases were asymptomatic, and in another 10%, the symptoms were atypical symptoms. They weren't symptoms that we would consider to be COVID norm specific. In China, there was a report there a couple of weeks ago that now whether this is just the Chinese playing funny beggars with their numbers, that they have started now to treat asymptomatic cases with positive test results as not cases, but they're logging them as positive results asymptomatic, but they're not including them in their case numbers. Now, there's the PCR test. So I'm going to say this to you, and then you can explain how I'm wrong or if in any way I'm right. The test the standard test that's being used in Ireland and across the world is this PCR test. It has been said to a couple of things. First of all, that in some ways it is excessively sensitive, because you might find a strand of RNA in the bloodstream, which could be from months.
Not in the nose, not in the bloodstream.
Oh, sorry, in the nose. Sorry, because it's a swab. And this could be from months previously. It could be a person who had the infection, now completely is completely recovered, and is not in fact contagious or infectious in any way, shape, or form, and therefore, and on the other hand, we have reports that it is producing 25% false negatives, which would suggest that, so 25%, that would mean in 25% of the cases that were going back as negative when the person was actually positive, which would make it, the utility of it. Now, I know that one of the things that Germany has been praised for is the level at which it's undergone testing. At the very early stages, it ramped up testing massively, and there's been a lot of concern here in Ireland that we haven't seemed to do a whole lot of testing, that it's kind of been sporadic. We set up all these systems to set up testing outside GA stadiums and stuff, and then they seem to sit idle. Tests. So just before I get on, also, could you just tell me, if I'm in Germany and I want to get tested for whatever reason, here to qualify for a test, I have to be either symptomatic or a close contact, and the test will take around 3 or 4 days. I mean, it may take 2 or 3 days to get tested, and then maybe another 3 or 4 days for the test result to come back. So what's the situation? First of all, what's the situation in Germany, but also, is that an accurate description of the test and the problem in relation to the test?
Okay. Well, let me just start with the test. Okay, first. The false negative. Let me start with that. The false negative. The scientific question is, how do you know it's false negative?
Well, I don't know.
Being that PCR is probably the most sensitive way that we have of detecting nucleic acid, which RNA or DNA.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, PCR is sensitive enough that you can be identified as a person, from the amount of DNA that you leave on a steering wheel, which is just in the sweat on your hands. So that's how sensitive PCR is. So I don't know. That would be a question where I would ask, well, what did you measure it with that So right. So it's
about the 25% negative.
Yes. So because PCR is exquisitely sensitive, you can detect in essence a single molecule. So it has been used, for example, to sequence DNA from Neanderthal. So you're getting a bit of DNA out of a tooth, right? Which is maybe 150,000 years old, and you can still amplify that. Okay, so it is exquisitely sensitive.
Okay.
The problem with so I would that false negative rate or false negative rate, I would really need to there are where PCR can run into false negative rates is if the swab is not taken correctly.
Okay.
So that's called a pre-analytic issue. So, for example, I know that at one of the airports in Germany, they were screening people who were coming back from hotspots, and in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is where I live, there are I think 5 airports, and in 4 airports they had trained medical personnel, and in one airport, I'm not going to say where it was, they had more or less lay personnel, and after a while they discovered that about 4% of the people coming from, let's say, Turkey, which is a hotspot, 4% of the returning travelers had positive results in all 4 airports, but for the airport where the lay personnel was taking the swab. So this was because the swab was not being taken incorrectly. So I think, if there are issues with a false negative test, it's much more likely to be due to what we call a pre-analytic issue, so that the sample isn't taken correctly.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, the PCR test, what you're detecting is, the problem is the other problem. If in order to have an infection, you need, first of all, to have viable viral particles. They need to be present in sufficient number. We've already discussed that. And they need to be viable. Now, it's hard to say alive because a virus isn't alive in that sense, but let's say, just to use that parlance, they need to be alive. They can't be dead, right? So if a virus is inviable, so if it's damaged, if it's been there for a while, okay, you will still be able to detect it, but this is an inviable particle that cannot cause infection. Mm-hmm. So the second thing is, so the question is, just because we have DNA or RNA in this case, just because RNA doesn't mean the virus particle is viable. And just because the particle is viable doesn't mean it's present in a sufficient amount to infect the person. And even if it manages to breach the initial layer of defense, the body may still be able to stop that infection. So it kind of breaches the walls, but it doesn't get any further. And only when enough virus gets inside the body, as it were, and then is able the virus, then when a virus gets into a cell, it more or less takes control of that cell. It's like a pirate getting into a ship. Okay, so it captures the cell and forces the cell to manufacture new virus particles. And only when that happens, then the cell starts to die. You start to get signs of inflammation. And only at this stage do you actually get symptoms of a disease. And that's only what matters to the individual, because we have to remember for example, bacteria. We have more bacteria on and in our body than we have body cells. So there are more bacteria on the surface of our skin and in our gut than we have cells in our body.
Yeah.
And we also are living in a sea of viruses the whole time, everywhere. So that's not the issue. The issue is not, is the virus there? The issue is the virus able to make us sick? So we should be moving our focus, which is to get back to what the Chinese are saying. It's really, more a question of who's getting sick rather than who has a positive PCR result. This is not to run down the PCR test. It's a very good test, but if it's being used in an incorrect setting, in other words, in people where let's say it's in Bayesian terms, the prior probability, there has to be a significant prior probability of the person having the disease in order for the test to work properly. So they either need to have symptoms or be a contact person or something like that. In those circumstances, the test works remarkably well. But if the prior probability of disease is low, well, then the same test will work much worse. That applies to every medical test.
So in a sense, at a mass testing level, we're asking to do a job which it's not
designed to do, and not just that test, which any test is not designed to do. Yeah.
The Italians have been rolling out and using quite a lot now this new, you can help me. It's not the antigen test.
Antigen test, yes.
Antigen test, which has a lot of, on the face of it, advantages.
Yeah.
By lay people, you spit. It's like a
rapid test, like the pregnancy test.
Pregnancy test. It changes color.
Yeah.
I don't know what this number means. I see it has ascribed to it a 94% accuracy level. I don't know what that means.
Well, the thing, nobody knows what it means, because you can't, as I was saying, is unless you know the prevalence. I'm going to get technical now and say it so it's on the tape. Unless you know the prevalence of the underlying condition in the population you're testing, you can't make a statement as to the accuracy. The technical term is the positive predictive value. So what we're really interested in with the test is what's called the positive predictive value. So if the test is positive, what is the likelihood that the person has the disease? That's really what we want to know. Everything else, sensitivity, specificity, these are only secondary values. They're only useful insofar as they help us to get to the positive predictive value, because the person wants to know, if I have this test and this test is positive, when doctors say positive, it usually means negative, right? It's bad. So if I have a positive test result, it's a bad test result. What is the chance that I have, let's say, lung cancer?
Yeah.
What is the chance that I have COVID-19? What is the chance I'm going to get sick with COVID-19? That's the relevant question. Or even more relevant is, what is the chance that I might get so sick that I might even die of it? And that's a completely different question to what is the chance that I'm going to get a positive test result. Depending, and the question, how many tests are positive is very strongly related to the population that we're testing in. And this is lost, unfortunately, in most of the coverage of testing.
But if we're looking for ways to try and control the spread of the virus or to contain it without resorting to level 5 lockdown again, do you think that there is a value to say, one of the things about the antigen test is that it's very cheap. So in theory, I could buy it, I could test myself 3 times a week, 4 times a week. Now, first question is, by doing it 4 times, am I increasing my likelihood of accuracy?
The thing is, because
I am. I don't, but the maths I know in these things is funny.
Well, the thing is, each test you do is only just just a snapshot in time, and you can go outside and meet somebody and talk to them for half an hour, and then you're positive, which you weren't half an hour previously.
But that's life in a sense.
That's like that. Now the thing about the test is there are 2 things we want to know. can it be false positive? So at the moment, the protocol is that if a test is positive, it has to be confirmed with the PCR test.
Mhm.
Now, in the first generation of PCR tests, there was only one, what's called a target, which was used. Now we always in my lab we used three. We always had tests that looked at 3 targets. So we never had a problem with false positive tests. We tested recently 30,000 teachers, and we found only 12 positive. That's a remarkable result. This was a healthy population, and we found virtually nobody. So the test seems to work quite well. And we'll have to wait and see with the rapid test how it holds up in practice. We don't really have enough experience with it yet.
Okay, I'll throw this at you. One of the things I've noticed as a layperson trying to read the literature, say masks have become this incredibly contentious issue about testing, not testing, whatever. I've noticed, shall we say, that doctors in the medical side tend to have demand very high levels of certainty about anything before they're willing to say it could be a useful thing to do. But say take the example of masks. One of the things I kept hearing from the medical side was we don't consider we don't think the evidence is strong to support the use of masks, or the evidence isn't. The engineers would say, well, we think there's anywhere between a 15 to a 35% chance that masks of this kind could produce this result. And the engineers would say, from an engineering point of view, that would mean we should do this because there's a low cost and a potentially decent utility to it. So do you think that maybe there is a bit of a problem when you're in the middle of a pandemic, that if you're doing something which is not actually noxious, shall we say, not actually dangerous, but that doctors tend to seek an excessively higher level of certainty and double trials, etc.? Is that a reasonable criticism?
Well, I mean, the first of all, probably the guiding principle of medicine for 2,000 years, has been primum non nocere. Okay, first do no harm. Now, this is a lesson that was learned painfully, because it's easy to take action. It's a much easier decision I learned this as a young doctor in the Mater Hospital in Dublin. It's much easier, the decision to put somebody up into the intensive care unit, that's easy. The difficult decision is getting them back out of the intensive care unit. So that, it's often easy to take action. And you have then, there's a thing called as well, the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So it's not a sufficient to say, well, we don't know, but it might work. Okay, that's the positive side of the argument. It might work. The negative side is, you said it has no negative consequences. Well, that's not actually true. I mean, there are lots of studies showing negative consequences of wearing masks. Psychological problems. There's problems that the mask, the way it's worn in the studies, for example, if you what the Americans call an N95 mask, once you put that on, it has to be fitted to you. And
I don't think anybody's advising that the ordinary people, wear N95 masks.
No, but if you look at the studies that have been done, they've been done often with masks. A surgeon, when he puts on the mask, never touches it again, and it discards it immediately afterwards. So a lot of the studies that have been done on masks have been done in settings that have nothing to do with the way masks are worn in practice. And to say, the thing is that we're producing a big change now in people's behavior. We're saying this has no negative side effects, but we don't really know that. It could be changing in some people the level of CO2. It could also, we're re-inhaling our own expired air. We don't know what effects that has. There are reports of people getting facial acne. People are touch the masks many times a minute. This has been investigated. So the thing is, the question of a mask, the way the mask has been used in a study setting, has very little to do with the way it's worn in real life. And the evidence for supporting masks, when you look at it, is as you said, a lot of doctors say, and I would say that too, the evidence is actually quite flimsy. And there's certainly an equal body of evidence, if you were to examine it, on the other side for not wearing a mask. And, you know, so the reason it has, this is part of the sub-dialogue, which is lockdown or containment measures. And I've already referred to the case of Sweden, where they had very lax containment measures. And yet now, in the second wave, they're doing better than, for example, France or Germany are doing. And also the overall mortality rate in Sweden in the long term, you know, over the last 10 years has not increased. So, you know, you have to, and a lot of these measures, it may be possible, it may be true, as you said, it may be true that in certain circumstances, masks have a small beneficial effect. I can't rule that out. It's very hard to rule something out entirely. But the other side of the argument, which is what deleterious effects are the masks having, needs to be investigated with at least probably more attention than the side, because we're changing something. So the person who's changing something has the burden of proof, not the person who's sticking with what we've always done.
I mean, I do find it a little bit odd, admittedly, and while I'm perfectly happy myself, if I'm going to a supermarket or whatever, I'm happy to wear a mask. If nothing else, if it reassures people around me. But I find there's something oddly comical about watching a horse race, where you've jockeys sitting on horses outdoors in spilling rain, traveling at 45 miles an hour, and they're wearing masks. And I want somebody to actually work it out. What are the probabilities, or indeed the possibilities, of getting the virus while traveling at 45 miles on a horse outdoors in the rain? Because I think the numbers must be pretty damn small. So listen, I'm aware of the time, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. But before we finish up, there's an announcement today here that we are now going to go into somewhere like a 4.5 or 4.9 lockdown. We're not quite 5, because rugby, GAA, and soccer will be allowed to go ahead. You won't be allowed to go to mass, but if you want to get into a scrum or a ruck on the try line, you can. Not that I have anything against people getting into scrums and then good luck and God bless, but I just think considering that, to my knowledge, clusters caused by people attending worship services in Europe are in and around none. And Ireland is the only country in Western Europe where their worship services are not allowed. That's just my little bit of politics out of the way there. Okay, I'm not saying wonderful utility, but for example, they're talking about boosting their contact tracing, and in conjunction with this, increasing the use of the rapid testing. 2 questions, I suppose. One is, if you were on NEFIT, which is become the high grand pejorum of Irish life, and you were advising
on what?
NEFIT is the expert body advising the government.
What does that stand for, NEFIT?
Oh God!
Is it Irish or is it English?
Well, it's an acronym of some kind. Irish? No, I'm sure it's English. National Emergency. I don't know, but
okay. NEFIT. Okay.
Of the great and the good, led by Dr. Holohan.
Yeah. Led by whom?
Dr. Holohan is his name.
Okay.
He's the chief medical officer. Anyway, it's got to the stage now that NEFIT are leaking before they talk to the government, or else the government are leaking NEFIT before NEFIT have published, and it's all terribly political and everything. But NEFIT are the people, and they've been pushing strongly for a level 5. If you were advising the government, you were on NEFIT, first, what would you say to the government? And secondly, if you were saying to one of our listeners or viewers out there that wanted to do things, they wanted to live their lives,
Mm.
they want to protect themselves and try and keep themselves safe. So first of all, to the government and then to the individual.
Okay.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, as we discussed previously in relation to the masks, it's very hard to prove a negative. So it's very hard to prove that the lockdown measures have no effect. Okay, it's very hard to prove that a mask has no effect. It's very hard, just scientifically, very hard to prove a negative. But if you're going to change something, the onus of proof is on the person who's implementing the change, that the cure is not going to be worse than the disease.
And to be fair, it would be amazing if you're talking about an infectious disease, if you massively clamped down on the mobility of human beings, that it didn't have some effect.
Well, that we would have to. It might have the opposite effect. We don't know, but we'll only know these things in retrospect. But let's assume it's having a small effect or an effect. Let's assume. Okay.
But is it commensurate with the benefit?
The question really is, because we don't know the effect. So again, using the precautionary principle, we will assume that it's having some effect for the benefit of the argument. But we have to then ask the question: is the effect that we're seeing commensurate with the cost? And the cost, we know, is enormous. And I mean, there's data from the United States, data from Britain, that, you know, there's economic data relating, for example, unemployment or loss of income to mortality. That sounds cynical, but it's actually fairly reliable.
No,
and
steady stuff. I mean, we've studies on the connections between life expectancy and years lost in poverty going back a year.
So we have to seriously ask the question: is the cost, both in psychological terms, in economic terms, and in medical terms, in terms of human suffering, commensurate with the really non-proved, it's not proven, but let's assumed benefit of the measures that we're taking? And you know, before the onus, you really have to, this principle has not been, to my mind, applied rigorously enough. The onus is on the person introducing the unusual measure. It's not on the person who's living normally. So they have to tell us why it's saving us. We don't have to prove that it's not, because you can't prove a negative, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing, in relation to the individual, I think the problem is, and we're seeing that everywhere, if you do surveys in countries, so for example in Britain, I don't know about Ireland, but in Germany, the vast majority of the population support these measures.
They do.
In fact, if you in Britain, I know this to be the case, and in Ireland, and in Germany rather, the majority of the population, like 70%, something like that, support even more radical measures. And so the question is, why are the people so afraid? So perhaps, you know, the big problem we're dealing with now is fear. And I'm not saying, you know, life, getting up out of bed in the morning is dangerous. Marrying somebody is extremely dangerous. Anything you do in life that has any meaning to it is going to be dangerous. So the question, I'm not saying that life is not dangerous, but you have to ask then, the question is the level of fear that you have, that is hindering you internally and externally, is it commensurate with the degree of risk for you? And I think, you know, for most people, I know you spoke about the at-risk people and so on, but for most people, perhaps it's not commensurate. And the third issue is, if you look at elderly people in residential settings, or a case that I was involved with, which was people with multiple disabilities, okay, mental and physical disabilities, cutting people like that off from social contact. You know, they should have a choice in that. They should be informed that there's a possible risk, but in the end, surely it's, to a certain extent at least, up to them. What do they regard as being, and that these questions are not being asked.
Several months ago, I read a piece by an Israeli virologist who said that one of the problems that we had to address, he said, as a profession, was increasing this notion that seemed to have got ground, that the virus was this thing hanging in the air, trying to get in your front door, trying to get at you. that his fundamental point was that there are things you can do to protect yourself. That of all of the things that you can do, social distancing is a useful prophylactic. If you maintain social distance, if you avoid going to pubs and nightclubs and whatever, if you limit, if you meet outdoors and these things, that you can reduce the risk of infection very, very significantly indeed, even if you are a person at risk. So, for example, if you have your grandparents and you want, and I know that what you say is absolutely true, and I think it's very sad because I know friends of mine who are locked in their houses, who their groceries are delivered to the back door, where they are sprayed and then left aside for a number of hours because there's somebody told them if you leave it for 6 hours then it's okay or something. But there's no contact. Whereas I think if they maintain a certain social distance, if they meet outside, that it isn't, that this isn't a virus which is, as I said, banging on your door trying to get at you. Is that, would you say that's reasonable?
Oh, I think that's certainly true. And you know, the thing about social distancing is in some countries it's 2 meters, in other countries it's 1 meter. In Germany it's 1.5 meters. So I mean, a lot of these things are arbitrary measures, right?
Yeah.
That are decided on by committee. It's important to remember that. And the second thing I would say is that we're coming into the flu season again now. And you know, every year we have a minor pandemic. It's part of winter, all right? You know, when coughing drowns the parson's saw, if you remember that, I learned that in school, the Christian Brothers, you know, and was it Greasy Joan doth keel the pot? That was a poem we learned. And milk comes frozen home in pails, but coughing drowns the parson's saw. Yeah, well, why? Because everybody's got a cold. It's the middle of winter, right? And so you know, this, if we were to examine, you know, each year with the same microscopic intensity that we examined the last year, we would see similar phenomena. We would see younger people dying occasionally. We would see, you know, clots in the lung. We would see some people who have long-term consequences. Why aren't we aware of that? Because we're not looking for it that intensely. And the problem that we have in the health services particularly is that we are devoting so many resources to this problem that we're sucking air out of the whole rest of the, you know, the rest of the entire medical system, and denying people care, you know, directly or indirectly. And so we have to, you know, we have to view the medical system, society in the whole, rather than just this part. And this is not just to say that if people are nervous, they can't do certain things. And it's not to say that there are some people who aren't at risk, but you have to, I think we've lost a sense of proportion. I think that's probably the main thing to say.
Well, listen, it's been fascinating to talk to you. For me anyway, it's been very useful to clarify a number of things that have been bugging me and I've been wondering.
Okay.
I'm sure for the viewers out there, it has been illuminating. So I'd like to thank Dr. Paul Cullen. I'd like to thank you for joining us. And again, I'd like to encourage you just to click that subscribe button, and if you can help us in the campaigns we have this coming winter, to click on the donate, and any help you can give us would be great. So anyway, mind yourself, stay safe, enjoy life, what life we have, let us enjoy it. Christmas is coming. Let's hope we can get there. Bye-bye.